Hi students, welcome back. In this segment, we are going to talk about a particular phenomena, well not a phenomena, a process that we are quite familiar with in India, outsourcing. If you're not already aware of this, starting from the mid 1990s onwards, India became very famous all over the world as a center for business process outsourcing. So certain kinds of business processes started to be relocated in India. Okay, it would be a familiar term, I think, to most people in our country. So in this segment, we are going to take a closer look at outsourcing. It's certainly a process that has a lot of detractors as well. We are going to take a look at what we mean by outsourcing and the different types of outsourcing as well. Alright, so let's start with the definition given by Ritzer and Dean. Outsourcing refers to the transfer of activities once performed by an entity to a business or businesses in exchange for money. Let's try and break down this definition. Okay, so at its very heart, it really is about transferring a set of activities that used to be performed in-house or internally by a specific entity. Okay, now this entity may or may not be a business, and we'll take an example of this. Okay, for instance, one of the types of activities that is being outsourced today is the outsourcing of military activities. So the United States Army, for instance, for its operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, it does not necessarily always send its own soldiers from the military. It may outsource this activity to external contractors. Okay, there is a business that is contacted and they put fighting men on the ground. Okay, so the origin of this activity, the activity that is being performed by the military is not a business. It's not run on a business model. Okay, so therefore that is why Ritzer and Dean use the term entity. What does happen in outsourcing is that this set of activities which was being undertaken by an entity, whether a business or a non-business, is now transferred to be done by definitely a business, and it involves always an exchange for money. Okay, so what are the essential components of outsourcing? Firstly, there is a transfer of activities that used to be done internally by a specific entity, and this transfer of activities always goes to a business, okay, or multiple businesses even, and these activities are now, once they're transferred, they will always be done in exchange for money. Okay, so this will become clearer to you as we take up some of the examples. Let's take a look at some of the different types of outsourcing that exist. So there is a distinction made between, in terms of outsourcing, between macro, meso, and micro level outsourcing, and usually this refers to the scale at which this activity is taking place. Okay. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind, maybe I should not have started off with an example, kind of foregrounding this discussion in terms of what we are experiencing in India, because what we experience in India is that a business process used to be done within a company located abroad, and it has sent off that activity to be done in India. Okay, so but it's not necessary that outsourcing always has to happen when across national borders. Okay, now it may be that let's say I am the Ford Motor Company. Okay, now the Ford is very famous for the cars it produces. Let's say at some point Ford used to handle every part of the production process and every part of the business process as well. Let's say at one point, if there were any complaints that I had with my Ford car, I could actually directly call into Ford the company and speak to the customer relations office there, or the complaints office there. Okay, so in that case, Ford would have been handling this whole business internally within their own business operations. At one point, maybe Ford does a stock taking and thinks that, you know what, running this customer service department is actually taking up too much. It costs the company too much, and it's also perhaps, we don't have any expertise in this operation. So why don't we actually hire some other company to take up this business process on our behalf? Okay, so that would be an example of macro outsourcing, because the scale of activity is actually very large, right? It's happening at the macro level. Now, in contrast to this, there is the meso level activity. So, in a meso level outsourcing, an example of it could be, let's say there is an eatery, a local eatery, okay, let's say Pandits. All right. So Pandits is very popular in Kanpur, but it does not have the kind of large scale business across cities and countries like Ford does. Okay. So Pandits decides, our dishwashing takes too much time, and it costs our company too much. So we will actually hire, let's say, a dishwashing company in Kanpur to handle the dishwashing operations for us. So because the scale of the activity being outsourced is medium level, that is why it is referred to as meso level outsourcing. Now, a third type of outsourcing is micro level outsourcing, and this is really done at a very small scale or even perhaps at an individual level. Here, I will give you an example of an activity which originally does not have a money value assigned to it, but when it is outsourced, there is a money value that is charged for it. Okay, let's take the example of elder care. Okay, so let's say there is a family and there is a parent who is very ill. Okay, not ill enough to be admitted to the hospital, but ill enough that you have to have someone who is going to take care of the parent. In that case, one of the things that various families do, if they can afford it, is to hire a nurse who will either visit the elderly person or who will actually stay with the elderly person throughout the day. Okay. Now, in this case, the scale of the activity, particularly in monetary terms, is, well, when it was being done by by members of the household, there was no monetary value assigned to it, right? And that's the really interesting thing. But once this is given off to an external entity, a monetary value is assigned to it. So if you have to hire a nurse or if you have to hire a caretaker, then you have to pay them a salary. Often now there are multiple arrangements. You can either directly reach out to an individual nurse that you know, or you may actually reach out to an agency who specializes in this activity. Today, of course, there are even platforms such as Urban Clap which are used to actually hire people for this. So this is so because the scale is so small, we refer to it as a micro level activity. I think this example is interesting because it should point out to you that in outsourcing, the source where the activity originally used to happen may or may not be a business, okay, and it may or may not have a monetary value assigned to it. However, once it is taken out of that entity, then it is always, in outsourcing, it is always given to a business, and there is always a money exchange that is taking place. Okay. Now let's move on to the type of outsourcing that perhaps we in India are most familiar with, which is offshore outsourcing. Now, the book defines offshore outsourcing as the transfer of activities involved in, related to outsourcing to a business which is located outside of the domestic border of the country. Okay, so let's say I am, I have a smartphone company. in India, and I say, you know what, there is the screen manufacturing is it's just too expensive to do it in house. So I may actually hire a company located in Vishakhapatnam to do this screen creating activity for me. That is an example of outsourcing. Okay, but if I send that activity out to be done by a company, let's say in the Philippines, right? There it is crossing the national border, and that is why it is referred to as offshore outsourcing. A corollary of this process is called the corollary of this process is called insourcing, and the difference between offshore outsourcing and offshore insourcing is simply from the it's a difference in perspective, right? So if we are talking from the perspective of the entity that is actually sending this set of activities out to a business located outside of the national borders. So from that company's perspective, which is, or that entity's perspective, which is sending this activity out, then it's offshore outsourcing. From the perspective of the business that is actually receiving this activity, right, it would be offshore insourcing. Now the book has a very interesting discussion actually about what happens when there is large scale outsourcing. As I told you, outsourcing has been at the heart of many heated debates related to globalization. It's certainly um, one of the most visible processes that we can see under globalization. And very often people assume that outsourcing is the entirety of globalization, right? So, for instance, you will hear in many politicians' speeches that so many in the West, particularly, so many of our business activities have been now outsourced. So, our people don't have jobs, right? All the jobs have, because all the industrial work has gone to places like India and China, all the jobs have gone with them. Okay, there are a range of critiques that are raised against outsourcing, but I suppose and you may want to ask, well, what happens when this kind of transfer of business activity happens from one place to the other? When you're looking at it from a global perspective, does it mean that the economies of these countries are getting decimated, which either send this activity out, and what happens to the economies that are receiving this activity? For instance, what has been the impact of this kind of activity on the Indian economy, and what has been the impact of offshore outsourcing in the American economy? You may want to consider, for instance, that the cost of different products and services has maybe declined for American consumers. Okay, and the book makes a reference to something called a theory by Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, of creative destruction. Right. So Joseph Schumpeter argued that capitalism is characterized by a process of creative destruction, where because there is so much competition and push for innovation, this actually leads to companies really decimating each other. And because there's so much competition, there is only like a handful of winners that emerges through the process. But he also attributed this kind of competition to be the source of all the innovation that emerges from the capitalist system. So the Ritzer and Dean argue that in some ways even outsourcing can be considered to be related to this kind of creative destruction. So we may find that processes are traveling from one location to another location, but in that by that movement, perhaps those processes are also improving, and maybe the cost and the value of the products itself may change. So I would say that the jury is still out on this one, but we can certainly see why it generates such tremendous opinions from a variety of different people.